Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, welcome to New Wine Tastings, and I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and I am very pleased to introduce to you today longstanding partner in crime, John Moorhead, and also Dr. Jay Wexler. Jay is the American legal scholar, or an American legal scholar, who was the first to study laughter at the Supreme Court of the United States. I'd love to have a discussion just on that subject. I need more laughter in my life.
It's important work. Somebody had to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really intrigued by that. His work also focuses on church-state issues, constitutional law, and environmental law. Also very important, pressing issues in our society and our world today. He is a professor of law at Boston University School of Law. He is the author of several books, and today we will be discussing his work on the subject of our non-Christian nation. This is the title of the book, Our Non-Christian Nation: How Atheists, Satanists, Pagans, and Others Are Demanding Their Rightful Place in Public Life. Redwood Press, 2019. And it's part of our discussion, our ongoing discussion on Christian nationalism and the naked public square, the clothed public square, and themes of that sort. So, John, why don't you just share a little bit about the backdrop to this in terms of Christian hegemony, religious pluralism, pluralism at large in our society before we ask Dr. or Professor Wexler our questions.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thank you, Jay, for coming on. I reach out to a lot of people to invite as guests for conversations, and you never know who's going to respond, especially positively. And I'm so glad that you decided to have this conversation with us today. I think it'll be very helpful. By way of background, Paul and I have been supporters of religious freedom, advocating for this for some time, and not just religious freedom for other Christians, but religious freedom for all. And so when I came across your work, it really spoke to me, not only because of that, but also because Paul and I do a lot of work also in conversations and relationships with minority religious traditions. Paul is editor of a journal, Cultural Encounters, and I recently co-authored a piece with a member of the Satanic Temple, which was a privilege to have that conversation and for Christians to watch it. In our context, it's constantly changing. Right now, it's post-Christendom, not necessarily post-Christian. There's still a lot of Christians in America. Christians still have a lot of influence, particularly in the political process, but it's post-Christendom in the sense that Christianity, in terms of having credibility, has really, especially during the last 4 years, moved to the margins when it comes to evangelicalism. And so we've got that context going on. We've got this post-Trump era that's about to begin here as the results of the recent presidential election take place. And I think what we're going to see is a pendulum swing from efforts at a federal and other levels to really privilege Christianity and Christians in the public square to try and redress some of that. And so we've got these minority religious traditions, as you know, Jay, that are wanting their voice made known in the public square. So all of that serves as background for our conversation today. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or did that kind of suffice?
Brilliant. Very good. Okay. Thank you.
With that as background, let's begin, Jay, with the first question. How did you come to have an interest in the subject of freedom of religion from a legal and other perspectives?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you so much for having me on the program. I'm really looking forward to our conversation and to talking to your viewers and listeners. My story with religion is a long story, and I grew up Jewish. My parents, so I grew up around Boston. My parents are New York Jews, I went to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvahed, and I bristled at the whole experience. For whatever reason, I just didn't feel like my teachers were answering my questions that I had. I didn't feel comfortable there. So that was sort of the beginning. And then I went to a Catholic school, high school. I was one of the 7 Jews who went to this Catholic school, and and at that point, I started developing my kind of atheist perspective. So I was kind of an atheist and a Jew in a very Catholic environment, and so I sort of thought a lot about the role of the minority in a kind of a Christian majority situation. And then when I went to college, I became an East Asian Studies major for reasons I won't get into, but I got really into Taoism and Buddhism there, and that sort of furthered my kind of interest in minority religions, I think. And I actually spent a year getting a master's degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School with the idea of going on to being a professor of religious studies of some kind in the Chinese area. But I decided to go to law school instead because my Chinese was like terrible. I mean, I studied, but I knew it wasn't going to cut it to be an academic. So I went to law school, but my interest in religion had was significant by that time. The year at the divinity school, and so I wanted to stay in the religion game, and I've always had this kind of minority perspective, as now it's like Jew, atheist, Taoist leanings kind of thing, and I got really interested in the religion clauses and in law school, and I wrote a paper, for a professor that got published, and from there I just ran with it. It's just such a fascinating and critically important area of law that and so rich in both intellectually and kind of just experientially that I've always, even though I occasionally start writing about something else, I always eventually come back to religion.
Thank you for your answer, John. Did you have any other questions for Jay along those lines?
Just a comment, just an acknowledgement and appreciation for the interest in working with the minority religions. I know as a Christian working academically and on a popular level, in the conversation with minority religions, I began doing work with new religious movements and have continued that. And those conversations with so-called fringe religions, I have found very enriching for me in not only in having that interpersonal relationship and learning to understand others, but it helps me understand where I'm coming from in terms of living out my own faith. So I think we can only be enriched with these kinds of conversations. So I appreciate your work and interest in that area.
Thank you.
And Jay, I noticed that there's a clicking noise at times. I don't know if there's something with the mic or what have you. I apologize for bringing that up, but
no, it very well could be. Sorry, it could be my playing with a pen. Let's see if it goes away.
Okay. Okay.
But I don't know. I'll try.
All right. But it's all coming through clearly. But thank you. Okay. Can you summarize the legal state of affairs on the Establishment Clause, and just if you could explain that for viewers too, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment in terms of freedom of religious expression for all?
Right. So the First Amendment has 2 parts when it comes to religion: the Free Exercise Clause, which is kind of about limiting the government's authority to burden religion and religious practice, and then there's the Establishment Clause, which is kind of about limiting the government's ability to support or promote religion to some degree. And so the Establishment Clause is the clause that people are typically mean when they're talking about separation of church and state or something like that. And so I just finished teaching my First Amendment course, so this is all fresh in my head, but it's also really complicated. So I want to, I don't want to talk too much about all the details and try to distill the basics. I mean, the idea of the Establishment Clause is that the government can't promote or advance religion in any way that it wants. There are limits on what the government can do, and it sort of depends on what the area of controversy is, what the sort of limits are. So, for example, when it comes to putting up religious displays or symbols, there's something called the endorsement test, in which the court says the government can't put up a religious symbol if that's going to send a message of endorsement to a reasonable believer that the government is, promoting one religion and denigrating other religions. How that gets applied by the justices and judges in particular cases is another story, but that's the test. And then, for example, when it comes to prayer, government-sponsored prayer in the schools. There's one rule that's very strict. It's about keeping school prayer, government-sponsored prayer, out of the school classroom and school kind of community. But then there's another area which we call legislative prayer, which is about the government's authority to start a government meeting, like a town board or a legislative meeting, with a prayer. And there, the government has a lot of leeway to start off with a prayer. And there are other areas too, like the funding of religion has certain rules. And I guess over time, what I would say is that maybe 25, 30 years ago, the Supreme Court was very concerned with policing this line of separation between the government and religion, and has become less interested in that over time, I think. And so the government is able now to do more promotion and more advancement of religion than it used to be able to do. And so we could talk more about specific areas if you were interested, but that's the general kind of Establishment Clause summary, I think.
Right, and I will ask another question related to that in a minute, but just what you had said, that the government's less interested in putting a check on religion's public expression and the like now, at least as it relates to governance. Why is that the government is less inclined that way now? I hadn't quite thought about that before. So
well, yeah. So what I was saying is that the Supreme Court is less concerned with keeping religion out of public life, for example, than maybe it used to be. And as to why that might be, it's hard to say. I mean, part of it is kind of general modes of constitutional interpretation, and Justice Scalia had a big role in that. Partially, I mean, if I speaking from my minority religion hat, I would say that there's for whatever reasons, it seems to be less concerned with how government support of religion might affect religious minorities in the current Supreme Court compared to how it used to be. Definitely, there's been just a change in thinking about also what it means to be neutral with respect to religion. Like it used to, the court always talks about neutrality towards religion. It's a very difficult concept because it requires the court to think about what the baseline is that you're measuring neutrality from. And it used to be that the baseline was like not helping religion at all. And so if you helped religion, then you were promoting religion. And now I think there's a greater appreciation for the importance of treating religion equally alongside other sort of similarly situated institutions that are not religious. Like, for example, in the school district, the government can fund religion as long as it sort of funds religion alongside, like religious schools, alongside non-religious private schools. And that the court now says is neutral. And when you can see, that that's a hard question. What counts as neutral? And so the court has changed its view about that over time. As to sort of why, it's hard to say exactly.
And would you mind just defining how religion would be understood here? I mean, would that include secular humanism? Would it include atheism in a broad sense of the term?
I think it would include atheism to the extent that we're talking about a group that takes the affirmative position that there is no God, or that we absolutely can't know whether there's a God. So I think it's really important to distinguish between things the government might do that have the effect of promoting ideas that might be inconsistent with some religions, versus the government promoting the view that there is no religion. So in other words, you can imagine two kinds of schools, right? School number one teaches evolution, right, but doesn't say anything about God. Now that, from some perspective, right, from some Christian perspectives, that's not a neutral curriculum, right? That is inconsistent with people's beliefs, right? But that's not the same as the government in a public school teaching that there is no God, right? Am I making any sense there? So that's a really big difference. And I think those two things get conflated, right? And people say, oh, the public schools are the secular space. And it's true that the public schools have some non-neutral effects on some religious believers, but it's not that the public schools are promoting atheism in the way that they could be, for example, right, in a different world.
Right, and that's how it shows how complicated these matters are. They're very complicated. Just I wanted to raise one other point here in terms of the historical backdrop. We talked about the First Amendment and the like. I'm thinking about James Madison with the memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments, that I think is an important document for consideration. And I just wanted to quote, and if you wouldn't mind just sharing your take on this and its import, because he was a very religious man. He also saw that if you favor one group, what's to say that another group can't come in later and oppose that group? So he was really trying to guard against hegemony one way or another, in my estimation. He's one of the founding fathers. So it's not as if they weren't concerned for these very issues. They really were, further to what you've already said. So I just wanted to quote, get your take on it if you don't mind, and then John can ask the next question. And again, James Madison writes, "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects, that the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3d only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever." Now, he was no doubt thinking about Christian groups and the like, but I think analogously, it does apply more broadly to our current situation. Your thoughts on that before, John?
Yeah, no, I think that's, I mean, Madison was a genius when it came to so many things, and his writings about religion and and the importance of being careful, about structuring the relationship between the government and religion. It continues to be incredibly important and helpful to hundreds of years later. And his point, is a really good one, and it takes a different guise now, right? When you have, it's true that Christianity is the majority religion, but still. But one can imagine small localities, for example, or cities, even states, as we move forward and religious diversity becomes greater and greater, there will be places which will be majority non-Christian, right? Even if the nation itself is not majority non-Christian, and so what's to say if it's the case that the government can put up Christian symbols, for example? What's to stop it from putting up? We wouldn't be Muslim symbols, but a Buddhist symbol or something like that in a town that happens to be predominantly Buddhist, or an atheist symbol, right? An actual symbol that says there is no God in a northeastern Boston suburb or something. You can kind of imagine that. So it helps to do the thought experiments. We often say, like, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance seems to many people very benign. But if you say, replace that with under no God or under Allah or something, right? It can make you think, well, it is important. And those minor things to some people are very, very critical. So it's Madison's thought experiment. It's different now than it was, but it's very analogous and very, very helpful to think through, I think.
Thank you, Jay. John.
Yeah, thank you for sketching all that legal background for those of us and putting it in language that we can understand for those of us who aren't legal scholars. I appreciate that. You've talked about, we have these laws of separation of church and state. We have laws that protect religious freedoms, as well as freedoms to be irreligious or atheistic or what have you. And yet in this country, there tends to be a situation in which there's Christian privilege. Christians may not recognize that. And we're going to talk about some instances of when it is recognized as to when that's changed. But we've got this Christian majority. Is that the major factor that contributes to this Christian privilege, or are there other dynamics that are involved in that process?
Yeah, so I think that the numbers might be the most important part of it. I mean, right, because you think of like a voucher program, right, which is a controversial religion and government issue. And in the cities where there are those programs, the percentage of religious schools that are Christian of some sort tend to be in the 90%, right? So it's true that any private religious school might be able to participate in a voucher program and therefore take advantage of government funding, which would help their religious mission. But in reality, who's going to get that money, right? There are Muslim schools, and in some of the voucher programs, there's 1 or 2 Muslim schools that get some of the money. But there are no Buddhist schools ever. I think there might be a Scientology school or 2. But so, and there are no atheist schools either. Like in the sense of our mission is to teach that there is no God. But there are lots and lots of Christian Catholic schools. And so that's just the numbers thing, I think. And so a neutral, in other words, a law that says, or a constitutional doctrine that requires formal neutrality, basically, that the government treat all religions alike, is going to benefit Christians more than minority religions just because of the numbers. But there are other reasons too, I think, that we might locate for Christian privilege. I mean, part of it is that it's, I think it's harder for a majority to tell when it's kind of symbols and cultural not baggage, but cultural, accoutrements or whatever are really, just part of the background, or are they really stand out as being important? I mean, if you believe in God and you've always believed in God, and when you see under God on the in God we trust on the bills, that this might not strike you as being a big deal at all. It's just sort of part of the world around us. To somebody who is an atheist and whose atheism is an central part of their identity, seeing that is really striking, right? But I think since the majority and the majority of judges are religious and monotheistic, they may not see these parts of the culture which are offensive to other people as being even notable. Right. So that's part of it. And there's I suppose those are the 2 largest things. I guess the one other thing I'd say fairly quickly is that it has, and this is something I talk about in my book, for most of the time where we've had the last 50 years or so, and we've had these controversies over church and state, religious minorities and non-religious people have tended to stay out of the public square, or wanted to stay out of the public square, on the theory that the public square should be fully secular. And so all religions should be out of the public square. Now that we've seen the Supreme Court kind of cut back on that and allow more religion into public life, we're starting to see minority religions and secularists saying, well, I guess we've lost this argument about the secular public square. So what are we going to do? We should maybe partake in that public square alongside the Christians. So that's just getting started. So we might see, and hopefully we'll see, more pluralism going forward, but that might help explain why a sort of a general rule that would help all religions seems to have the effect of helping Christianity more so these days than other religions.
Thank you, Jay. And you've already touched upon the next item, and that as the government, or the Supreme Court rather, is less inclined to oversee this and keep the boundary markers in place, some of the minority religious traditions are entering more fully into the public square to rub shoulders, to contest for space, etc. So if we could talk about a few of the examples in that regard, that would be helpful. One of the cases you write about is Summum, and I don't know if I say that correctly, Summum.
I
But
actually don't know.
Okay.
Summum. We will say it differently each time. I mean, I think I call it the Summum.
Okay.
Not 100%.
So, and it's in Salt Lake City, and John is located in the Salt Lake City area.
Oh, great.
Can you tell us about this group and its legal efforts in regards to putting up their own public monument?
Sure. I love Salt Lake City. I really love that city. It's beautiful. Like everywhere you're there, you see mountains everywhere. So
next time you're out here, we'll get together for coffee. We'll talk about religious freedom. There you go.
Sounds good. So the Summum, right, are a fascinating, very, very small religious group in Salt Lake City. I was unable to sort of figure out how many people actually belong to it, but I would not be surprised if it was only a dozen. I mean, they say it's more. That doesn't matter though. It's a small religious group, and it was founded fairly recently in the 70s when an individual had a dream or visions in which superior beings came and spoke to him. They were kind of, and those are the summum, and they conveyed messages to him that were very Egyptological. There's a pyramid is kind of central symbol in the religion, and also mummification is an important part of it. And so, but one thing that he saw in this vision was the summum told him that the Ten Commandments were not the most fundamental law that God wanted to hand down to humans. But when at the time he gave the Ten Commandments to Moses, I'm sorry, he was going to give the more fundamental message, which was the 7 aphorisms to Moses, and decided that Moses and the people weren't ready, so gave him the 10 Commandments instead. But there are these more fundamental tenets, which are known as the 7 aphorisms, and that's what the summum that's their fundamental law, kind of. And so the Summum believe in the 10 Commandments. They just think the 10 Commandments is kind of a completion of this prior thing that has only been given to their group. So they wanted to, backing up a little now, in Pleasant Grove, Utah, a little pretty town not so far from Salt Lake, there's a park, a public park, and in that park there's a 10 Commandments monument that's been there for a while. It's constitutional for the 10 Commandments to be, 10 Commandments like that to be up in a park like that under the certain circumstances. So, which we could talk about, later. It's a constitutional question, but in any event, it can be. And but what the Summum said is, if you're going to have the 10 Commandments up, you should also have our monument up next to it or near it, the 7 Aphorism monument. And so they asked the town of Pleasant Grove, and the Pleasant Grove said, no, we're not putting that up. And their reasoning was something like, the 10 Commandments are part of the history of the country and the history of the town, whereas the 7 aphorisms are not. And the Summum thought that was unfair to them, so they sued, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, rightly, said that when the government puts up a monument, the government itself is speaking, and so the government can say whatever it wants, and you can't kind of force the government to say what you think the government should say. So the 10 Commandments were okay because it was the town speaking. And if the town wanted to not put up this other monument, it was within its rights to do that. And so that's how the case came out. But I met with that group. I met with the group. I spent an evening with them and got to know them a little bit. Very, very interesting group. And I understand what they were trying to do there, and respect it a lot, but they were unsuccessful.
So just on that point, I could see how a viewer or listener might be confused by how the Supreme Court decided that if the government makes that determination, it would be okay. Would it be because they were thinking for historical reasons only, not necessarily to promote the Judeo-Christian heritage, but more for that purpose? Because one might say, well, isn't that, hegemony? Isn't the government, basically in cahoots with a particular religious tradition? So I could see how viewers might be surprised, based on the nature of our interview, that you had just said, well, you thought appropriately the Supreme Court made that determination that way. Just for the sake of clarity for the viewer, how that plays out. And I'm sorry if it's confusing how I'm framing it, but that I could see how they're asking.
Yeah, sure. No, and it is confusing because the problem with the Summum case, in my view, is not the Summum case itself. It's the previous case, which was known as Van Orden versus Perry, which was the case that said that it's okay for the government to have a long-standing 10 Commandments monument up on public property. So my argument about the Summum is taking that as a given. But I don't agree with the Supreme Court's decision in Van Orden. I think you're right. That 10 Commandments decision is a decision that is a pro-Christian decision, I think, and it kind of and so it does I bristle at the court's decision in the Ten Commandments case, because I think this goes back to what we were talking about a little earlier, that this is, the Ten Commandments looks very different to somebody who is a Christian and maybe a Jew also, because the Ten Commandments are shared. But to somebody who's not a member of those faiths or has no faith at all, the Ten Commandments is a very clearly a religious symbol. And so the idea that the government can put it up on public property without violating the Establishment Clause is troubling. And what the Supreme Court said is something like, and this is really hard to explain too, because it basically came down to Justice Breyer writing a separate opinion saying, I think it's okay. It was very unclear kind of rationale. But I mean, I think basically the court thought the Ten Commandments is something that has a long history in the United States and is related to the history of the United States in some way. And it's not particularly sectarian. It's very hard for me to explain what they said. Not all Ten Commandments monuments are okay, by the way. It's primarily the ones that have been around for a long time. For Justice Breyer, he thought if you took down the Ten Commandments monument, it would be more divisive and more, conflict causing than keeping it up. And I don't agree with that either.
So
but
it's interesting though, isn't it? How, we tend to think the Supreme Court might just look at either like for some, original intent or, case study precedent, which in this case, it was based on precedent. But, they're accounting for all kinds of utilitarian arguments. Like if we take it down, then, it's going to cause for more contention. So it's striking that they're not just, isolated in this regard. They're accounting for what are the pros and cons in our society. It's really complicated and convoluted at times, isn't it?
I remember when I helped prepare the people who were the lawyers who were arguing in that case, and I remember at the moot court oral argument, a lot of our conversation was we were trying to figure out what Justice O'Connor would do, because it turned out that Breyer was the one who did the switch, but O'Connor was the swing vote, and she was very pragmatic, and so we were trying to figure out, how are you going to convince Justice O'Connor that it's a good idea to bulldoze, Ten Commandments monuments all over the country, and it's a hard and nobody did convince her. So I mean, it depends on the judge. It depends on the justice, how much those considerations are going to matter. But they do matter to Justice Breyer, and they did matter to Justice O'Connor. So
interesting. Thank you very much, John.
Yeah, but there is one group that has been a little more successful in challenging Ten Commandments monuments. I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the Satanic Temple. I've had some interaction with them through co-authoring and podcasting and things like that. I find it an interesting group, but it's also very controversial. There are certain religious groups that really bother conservative evangelicals more than others, and Satanists would probably be at the top of that list. But this group, if we can set aside the angst just by thinking about interacting with Satanists, I think there's something that conservative evangelicals and other Christians can learn about some of what they've done. Can you talk about how the Satanic Temple has challenged Ten Commandment monuments on public state space in various states, and how can we see beyond the controversy and the provocation to see the real issues and be a little more self-critical as evangelicals about this topic of religious freedom?
Okay, sure. I mean, I'll start, and if I start going off track, pull me back, because I can talk about the Satanic Temple all day. I agree they're a fascinating group, and they're central to my book because they've taken on the First Amendment and Christian hegemony as one of their core missions. And I mean, we could start by saying what they believe in. They don't believe in a personal Satan. They worship Satan as a symbol for rebellion against oppression, kind of something like that. And so they don't have, they're not like the 80s satanic panic Satanists. They're not harming people. They're not killing animals or babies. So you have to The group comes with all of the associations of Satanism, and that's very purposeful, but it also does not incorporate all the things that one might think about Satanism. So one thing is that they teach that it's worth really understanding who it is you're dealing with, right? And so it is important to get past some of the superficial things that one might think about Satanism to understand this group. And really what they are, there are many things. One thing they are is just a very, very far left political group. Another thing they are is a genuine religious group, beyond all the stuff about the First Amendment, and of course that's what we'll talk about in a second. But I do want to make it clear that regardless of what the origins of the Satanic Temple might have been, it has become, I believe, a genuine religious community that holds all sorts of beliefs, and they have all sorts of rituals and such. But on the First Amendment part, what the Satanic Temple has done is it's basically said, we don't think there should be religion in the public square. We don't think the government should be supporting religion in public, either funding it or letting religious monuments go up on public property, or starting off meetings with religious prayers. But that if the government is going to be allowed to do that, and if the government is going to do that, then they have to treat all religions equally. And the Satanic Temple knows that people will bristle very strongly against the idea of the government supporting the Satanic Temple. And so they purposefully ask to participate alongside Christians in various ways. For example, they have asked to give prayers before public bodies. Like, so the Christians went this week, we would like to go next week. And as you say, they've also been involved in the monument game, so to speak. And so whenever there's but they have built, and I actually have a little replica of the Baphomet statue here. So there's an actual 9-foot version of this in Salem. And it's an occult figure. And they have tried to, first in Oklahoma and now in Arkansas, tried to get the governments there that have put up 10 Commandment monuments to also put up their monument to Baphomet, the thing I just showed you, not the little one, but the real big one. And the idea is to illustrate, what happens when the government supports religion. From a Satanist perspective, the government supporting a Christian symbol is very offensive. From a Christian perspective, the government supporting a satanic symbol is very offensive. But you might not recognize that unless somebody actually comes forward and says, please put up our satanic symbol, and builds one, right? And then it basically, it's sort of shining a mirror, I think, is what they want to do to some of these practices that they find offensive or problematic. And they've had some success and some failures. The Baphomet case is continuing. I don't know if they're going to win that. I'd be surprised if they were to win that case. But I'm not sure that winning the case is the full game. Like just bringing the lawsuit and getting publicity for it is part of the goal. So maybe I'll just pause there and see where you want to go, if you want to stick with that and what you want to talk about there.
John might have a question.
Yeah, just by way of follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just by way of follow-up. It's been interesting and frustrating for me to see. Can you hear me? Are we okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
To see some of the reaction of conservative Christians, Catholic groups, for example, evangelicals, have been very visceral in their reaction. And again, I understand because they're dealing with Satanism, but as you pointed out in your comments, it's a stereotype of Satanism. The Satanic Temple, like most Satanists, are atheistic. And so Satan functions more in a symbolic kind of way. But our hope is that rather than having the anger because they're provoked, I think what I hear you saying, Jay, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that provocation that Christians feel in response to what the Satanic Temple does with that Baphomet statue is similar to the provocation that atheists, Satanists, and others feel when they see Christian symbols put in the public square. So am I hearing you correctly?
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you know, Satanism does that in a way that, for example, atheism cannot do it. I mean, the Satanists, the Satanic Temple are atheists in the sense that they don't believe in a personal Satan, but they're more than just an atheist group. The symbols are central to who they are, and atheists, you know, just as atheists, don't have that, right? I'm an atheist. We have a bench in Florida, right? I mean, a bench, you know, some people will get mad about a bench, but most people will be like, all right, it's a bench. But a satanic, you know, figure or something really is you know, different. It's a different story. And so it forces, I think, the majority to confront how the non-religious might feel, or the non-Christian might feel about the Christian symbol, like the 40-foot cross that was just, you know, argued about in the Supreme Court a year ago or so. Yeah, so yes, absolutely, what you say is correct. And but you know, let me add also, you know, you said you have you know, expressed some frustration with communities that you're in touch with, and I express you know, I'm frustrated with some of the communities that I'm you know, more closer to. Like I have a lot of, obviously I know lots of atheists, and I think that lots of times atheists don't understand religion and don't try to understand religion, and, you know, have a knee-jerk reaction against religion and religious freedom, for example. And I think that's just as you know, problematic as the response that you're talking about with Christians to minority groups. So there's a lot of, you know, learning and compromise to go around, I think.
Well, and I think the you know, the statue, like the cross or the Ten Commandments or the satanic statue, it's not like putting up a statue of Donald Duck, is it? I mean, it's like it's very visceral. And I think often we're not in touch with one another's moral intuitions. John and I are very intrigued and appreciative of the work of Jonathan Haidt. I hear it pronounced different ways. His book, The Righteous Mind, and how we need to really seek to account for different people's moral intuitions, you know, both liberals and conservatives, because if we just poke the bear, it's only going to cause for more trouble. And I, you know, as a Christian, I need to make sure that I'm trying to understand as best as I possibly can the moral intuitions. And I don't want to call them immoral intuitions, as many Christians might, but moral intuitions. What is it that they are articulating and concerned for that I should really try and understand, and in a sense, the rightful sense of it, to empathize with on these matters? And I know for some Christians, my sense is historiography is going to come into play with this whole discussion. Well, if it was founded as a Christian nation, as some will argue it was, then we just have to go back to the way it was. And I think for another discussion, no doubt, John and I will have to deal with the historiography there, because, you know, I don't think this country was founded as a Christian nation. I think there are many Christians, there are many Puritans and like, but I look at Thomas Jefferson as a deist. He wasn't an Orthodox Christian, and many others like him. And so it was always a mixed bag. But for those who think it was founded as a Christian nation, it doesn't matter anything we're saying here for them. It's like we just have to go back to the way it was, because that's what the founding fathers had in mind. But that's why I bring up James Madison again, because here he was a Christian and very concerned, yes, for other Christian groups, minority sects and the like, but that always seeking to make sure he was accounting for them. And I would think, either way, it's an argument from silence, I suppose, but that analogously, as we said earlier, we need to account for other traditions that come into play, because we didn't have as many Muslims in America at the time, or Confucianists or Buddhists. No doubt there were some, but it wasn't at the level of what we have today. So that's just further thought for our series of episodes. John, why don't you take the last or second to last question? I'll take the last one for Professor Wexler.
Yeah, previously we were talking about Satanic Temple. We noted that many of that they're an atheist group, a Satanist atheist group. But let's talk about the challenges that atheists have had. You know, we tend to think about religious freedom in terms of specific religious groups, but atheists have had their own challenges. The Pew Survey has noted time and time again, as they ask, how do you feel about various religious groups, that evangelical Christians have very cool and negative feelings about two groups in particular, Muslims and atheists, and usually atheists are at the bottom of that list. And so there's this tension and animosity between Christianity and the realm of atheism. So what kinds of struggles in terms of religious freedom have atheists faced in America?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's hard in a sense to analogize, because atheists, you know, sort of by our nature don't have practices exactly. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is fairly recent, but I think it encapsulates the problem of being an atheist fairly clearly. You know, a few years ago, 5 years ago, the Supreme Court decided a case called Town of Greece versus Galloway, which is the case that said that the government can start off its town board meetings with a prayer, and the prayer can be as religious as the person who's been invited to pray wants. And so it doesn't have to be to a generic God. It can be to Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, or whatever. But the court also said that towns can't discriminate when they're deciding who can give the invocation. And as a result of that, you know, I think a lot of atheists and religious minorities did not like that decision, but they sort of grasped onto that non-discrimination language and said, well, okay, so if Christians are going to be allowed to start the meetings off with a prayer, we should also be asking to give invocations ourselves. And lots of both minority religious groups, but also secularists, have given invocations before town board meetings in the last 4 or 5 years. Like, there's been an actual movement to get that going. In the past year or two, a few jurisdictions have decided that while minority religions can give, you know, we're gonna respect this non-discrimination language from the Supreme Court when it comes to other religious groups, we're not going to let atheists give invocations. And so, for example, the U.S. House of Representatives has a new rule that says atheists can't give invocations. Brevard County in Florida had a similar rule. The House of Representatives in Pennsylvania had that rule. And two of those cases have gone to federal courts of appeals that have upheld the government's decision to exclude atheists. So there's a situation where I think, you know, atheists look at that and say, it's true we don't give prayers in quite the same way, but we can give invocations to solemnize and make, you know, serious the meeting that's going to happen. We can give, you know, welcoming speeches that make everybody feel comfortable. We can talk about our own moral values. We do everything that other groups of people can do to start a meeting, and we're just being excluded because, you know, we don't believe in a higher power, and that's unfair and unconstitutional. So that's just an example of how atheists, you know, are excluded. You know, that's kind of a rare, like, actual legal exclusion, but there and so it's more pointed, I think, than other kinds of exclusion, which are just sort of results of how things are in the world. Like, there are no atheist schools, for example, I mean, as an example. But so I guess that's how I would answer it, is that there is a frustration that atheism is sort of a second or third class kind of belief system.
Thank you, Jay. John, did you have a follow-up to that or no?
No, thank you for sharing, Jay. I appreciate that.
The last question, Jay, relates to our audience, you know, many of whom will be evangelical Christians, and there's a lot of reticence, as you're aware, amongst evangelicals for us to even have this conversation, at least a certain sector of evangelicals. Back to Hayter Height's work, it could be seen as that we're traitors, if you will, to the cause of evangelical Christianity, that we're actually thinking that we need a very public square for religious expression. So we're not about the naked public square, and that's where they might resonate with us. But when I say, and when John says a clothed public square, we mean for all traditions to have their space, including humanist, including atheist, including pagan, etc., Satanist, and the like. That doesn't make us Satanists. That doesn't make us atheists. But it can almost seem as if we are, right, John? I mean, that from our tradition, that would be seen as that there is a traitor in the midst. Now, to our tradition, I'm speaking to our tradition here. I believe that when we open up the discourse to include all participants, if we're living in the United States of America, and then I'll come to my question and ask you what you think about it and push back at me if you will. But I think from a sociological standpoint, like as we open it up, and it's the free market of ideas in America, when we really truly open up the free market of expression, to play off that language, it actually can strengthen traditions, hopefully not in a hegemonic way. That's not what I'm after. But I think back to Acts 17, the Apostle Paul's on Mars Hill, and they surely didn't think the way he did. And he sees the idols, he grieves over the idols, and yet he engages these philosophers, quoting a hymn to Zeus in the affirmative. And Paul was able to navigate a very pluralistic culture exceptionally well, and didn't seem to be at a loss to do so. I think we need to go back to that tradition more so than per se, we have to go back to the founding fathers toward a kind of Christian hegemony. I think it actually strengthens Christian faith to increase our vitality if we look at it in some respects as a free market of religious ideas or ideas, and each group bring forth the best of their tradition, their perspective to engage. I think that makes for healthy, rigorous discourse, not to shut one another down, but to invite rational, respectful discourse. I think that it will increase and strengthen Christianity in America, not lessen it. But also, I don't say that from a hegemonic perspective, but really in an open way to learn from others, to be open to being convinced by other traditions, even while seeking to have that opportunity to persuade as well. Your thoughts, Jay, on that? Any concerns you have on what I'm saying, or John as well?
I mean, I think I agree with everything you said. I mean, I obviously can't speak to the evangelical Christian community, or no authority to speak in that realm. But from everything you say makes absolute sense to me. Both, and I would say, it goes both ways. Also, that I think people who are atheists, are too quick often to reject religion in all its forms and just to assume it's I don't know what the assumptions are, but there are many different assumptions about religion and that it's a backward-looking kind of moral system or whatever people might think. I think all of that is a problem, and I think if we're going to live together in a pluralistic nation, we have to get along, and we have to be willing to listen to each other. I mean, I just got off Twitter, for example, because I realized it's like a nightmare. I've been on. I think things like social media just make all of this worse, because there's just no room for the conversations you're talking about on social media, and so there's a real question about how we're going to bring about this engagement between and amongst religious and non-religious groups. But the idea that it has to happen if we're going to live together in a pluralistic society that's getting more and more diverse, as we go along, it just seems like we have to figure that out. And so I agree with everything you said, and I think it applies both ways. And hopefully things like this, right, our conversation today will go some way towards accomplishing that. I remember talking to somebody in the religion department at BU, and we thought of this idea that, would it be interesting to have a podcast where you basically had some sort of political or ethical question for the week, and you invited, a member, a Wiccan priestess, a Christian, minister, and an atheist. and just see what happens. What those conversations would be like. And I don't know, but that's the kind of thing it sounds like you're talking about that I agree with, and I hope we get there. I hope we get there.
It's to me hopeful when we can have, in the midst of our strong differences, metaphysically or philosophically, theologically, right? I mean, you're an atheist, I'm a Christian, an evangelical Christian, but we're both seeking dialogue. And I think instead of this in-group, out-group dynamic that we have so often in play, what's that going to lead to down the road for our country? Not good.
Yeah.
This kind of conversation is what we need, and we're really grateful to you, Professor Wexler, for your time. John, any last thoughts or questions before we close it up for today?
Just really quickly, I would resonate with what you said, Paul. I do think that's the way forward. I would just add to that, Diana Eck, I think she's at Harvard. She's done a lot of work in religious pluralism. She distinguishes between diversity and pluralism. She says we have diversity in America, whether we like it or not, but what we need to do is work towards pluralism. That is, Jay says, how do we get there? We have to do the hard work within our own communities, whether it's within atheism or evangelical Christianity, have those intra-faith conversations and education, working on the emotions and so on. And then that prepares us for these important multi-faith or interfaith kinds of conversations. And we have to be willing to work through those differences and have these difficult conversations, but do it in a respectful kind of way. And hopefully that's what we're trying to model in these kind of podcast conversations.
Well, thank you very much, both Jay and John. Just again, for our viewers, Professor Jay Wexler of Boston University and the Boston University School of Law, and the author of Our Christian Nation, Our Non-Christian. No, it was not a Freudian slip, I hope, but our Non-Christian Nation, how atheists, Satanists, pagans, and others are demanding their rightful place in public life. A recent publication, Redwood Press, and I encourage our viewers to purchase it, to read it, and to further the discourse. So, Professor Wexler, Professor Moorhead, thank you both very much for your time. I'm Paul Lewis Metzger, signing off for my colleagues and myself for this episode of New Wine Tastings. Blessings to you all.
Thank you so much. This is great. Thank you for having me.